Chris, and I'm a music teacher within the Toronto District School Board. I'm here to help you with your Ontario Provincial Honor Band euphonium audition. First, we're going to start off with the scales. Now, the key to scales is maintaining a consistent tone throughout the whole octave, or for all octaves. If you were going to start with a full tone and end up with a thinner tone up at the top register, that might be not as good as something that is more full, because if you're at the top register, you always want to try to maintain an open cavity within your mouth to make sure that the sound stays open and clear. I will demonstrate what it might sound like if it's a bit pinched at the top end of the first chromatic scale. So this is something that you're going to try to avoid. You might hear that it gets a bit thin and not as full at the top register. Here's what you want to do to make sure that you get a full tone throughout it. First, you want to take a big breath. You want to try to do a whole breath in the full slur marking, and you want to sit up straight and tall and make sure that your diaphragm area expands when you breathe. Things your music teacher probably told you already. Also important, a small detail, is to make sure you hold that last whole note for all 4 beats. You can take a very nice breath after that. It doesn't have to be quite metronomically in time, as long as you just get a nice full breath. So I'll play the last 2 bars of that first line and then go into the descending. That's it. Same thing goes for the F chromatic scale. If you have a 4th valve on the bottom of your instrument, oftentimes that helps with tuning. So for an instance, for the high F in my instrument, it's very, very sharp. If I use this valve for the high F, it becomes more in tune. Same thing goes for the low F. If I were to use this, it's more in tune for the low F. Here's the sound difference from the low F. Without the 4th valve, it's quite sharp. With it, it gets more in tune. Same thing with the high F. Maybe they can see it here. So if you're also thinking for tuning for each note, that's a good trick. For the G major scale, same idea. You want to make sure you tongue all of them because there's no slur marking, but you do want to make sure you take a nice deep breath and try, if you can, to get the whole top and bottom end of it in one breath. If you want to play it faster and you can still do it in an accurate way, go ahead, as long as it's the most accurate at the fastest tempo you can. You always want to play slower and more accurate as opposed to faster and a bit sloppier. Same thing with the G major arpeggio scale. When you get to the high G, make sure you're still keeping an open cavity within your mouth to make sure that the sound stays resonant. On that higher G, try not to cheat by keeping the 1 and 2 down, because that will not have as good as a sound as it would with an open D. Even though it's easier to just keep 1 and 2 down, try not to do that. Same thing with the A flat major scale. You want to keep the higher notes open. And if you're a bass trombone player and you're playing the B flat major scale descending, you want to make sure that when you go down, you think of O, the vowel O. So I can do it with my euphonium because I have this last valve. Alright, so as a bass trombone player, that would be easier than a euphonium player. But even if you're a euphonium player, maybe you want to try it just for fun, because that would be a good way to actually expand your lower range if you have the 4th valve. So that's it for the scales and the arpeggios. Again, to recap, make sure you keep a consistent tone throughout all the octaves, and make sure you're playing at a tempo that will be the most accurate you can. So now I'm going to walk you through Etude Set A. There's 3 etudes in this set. The The first one is the ever so popular "Oh Danny Boy." So you know that whoever's listening to this piece has heard it before, over and over again. So that's why you have to make sure that you put your own stamp onto this own recording of yours, okay? So to start off, you see that it says espressivo, which means expressively, and it says 52 beats per minute. Personally, I think that's a little bit slow, and I want you to think of this more as a singing. So if you're going to sing this melody, would you sing it at 52, which is "Oh Danny Boy"? Or would you sing it a little more flowingly? "Oh Danny Boy"? So you want to always have the singing of this in your head while you're playing. Which brings me to another point on metronome markings. When you have a lyrical piece, you do not ever want to stick to it like this, because who sings like this? No one. So let me demonstrate how it would sound like if you were going to keep it to a metronome first, and you can see what the difference is after. That's quite with the metronome. Here's how I would do it, thinking of phrasing and in a singing style. So at the beginning of the phrase and at the end of the phrase, so at the tail ends, you always have a bit of a slower tempo, and then it builds in the middle to the higher registers and then back down. So you can follow that kind of model for most of it, but you don't want to make it too obvious, because then it will sound like you're seasick or something. I'll continue in the third bar. If you remember how I was breathing in the middle, it wasn't very rhythmic breathing, it was more slow and relaxed breathing. So you want to make sure you're not thinking that you have to keep up with the tempo, because you're by yourself. So there's no band you have to play with, there's no piano player or accompanist you have to play with. So take nice deep breaths in the middle of those phrases, and make sure you take time for the musical phrasing to breathe. Here's how it would sound if the breathing wasn't as relaxed. So there wasn't time for the phrase to end. It was very quick breath, and it went to the next one. And personally, I think that's a bit too much of a rush for when you transition into your next phrase. Then there's the very important part of the climax of this piece, which be in between measure 13 to 14. So for there, obviously before you get to the climax of a phrase, you never want to breathe the bar before. So between 13 and 14, don't breathe. And make sure you take your time, milk every note of bar 13 leading into 14. So here's a difference between someone who will be playing, again, metronomically, the first one, and the second one will be someone who plays more with feeling. I'll start at measure 12. So that's something that'd be more with the metronome. Here's something that you might want to think about doing, milking every note. So there's lots of tension, and then release on the downbeat. So make sure you really play around with that, see what you feel comfortable doing, and do what feels best for you. So those are some tips on the first etude. Now we're going to go to etude number 2. The trick with this one is making sure your intervals are spot on, because there's some jumping here and there, and that your articulations are distinct between one another. So for example, in the first two measures, you have notes of normal length. Then you have in the second measure a staccato note and also a tenuto note. So make sure that you're differentiating between all of the different articulations. Da da long, short, short, long. If you can't sing this phrase in your head, you're probably not going to pitch it well. Da 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 da. And then after that, you have a very interesting eighth rest on the very beginning of your third bar. So make sure you're really feeling that. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. I'll start from the beginning again. So I'm going to try stamping on the downbeat, and you'll hear it. So that's what you got to feel on the downbeat. So you start now with a forte, which is my next point, dynamics. You start with a forte, the second line, you go to piano. So try to make it a big difference as possible. I'll start from measure 4. So you see that every new phrase is building and building and building. So the most comfortable you are in terms of a loud dynamic, that's going to be your starting point. So how loud can you play where it still sounds good, and how soft can you play where it still sounds good, and then make sure for each phrase in the middle you still sound like you're building. A trick is to get someone to listen to you play this. Oftentimes in your head you might have the intention of playing louder and louder and louder, but the listener might not actually pick it up as well as you are, because the intent is there, but the sound production actually doesn't come out as much as you would think. So again, have someone listen to you and see how much your dynamic changes are actually happening. Do they actually hear it? Maybe not. So those are some tips with Etude number 2. Lastly with that one, the tempo, you want to make sure that you play it at a tempo that you can play cleanly as possible, close to 150. If you have to play a little bit slower, that's okay. They're not going to have a metronome there when they're listening to you and see what the tempo is, as long as it sounds lively and it sounds quick enough that it's around 150. And lastly, we have Etude number 3. Etude number 3, you can think of something that's more lyrical, but not as cleanly lyrical as our first Etude of O Danny Boy, but more of, there are some technique elements to this, such as some fingering, fast fingering. So we're going to actually look at those things right now. I would like you to go to bar number 3. With these rhythms, the dotted rhythms, it's always very easy to rush those. So what you want to do is subdivide into 16th notes, those notes there. So how it would sound if it was normally played would be like this. So in your head, the constant 16th notes should be going forward, but playing, it should be only what's written. And that will help you not rush the space in between those notes. Okay? Also, what you want to do is make sure from the beginning of this phrase to measure number 5, you have a very distinct difference, again, with your dynamics. I'll start from the beginning. What did you think of my dynamics? Were they big enough difference? Do you think I could play softer? I think I could play softer. So always try to push yourself to get even softer and softer as possible, especially if there's no double piano marking, pianissimo marking anywhere else. So you can show your dynamic range as much as you can. I also want to bring your attention to measure number 13. Now, you might see those notes and think, oh man, they're pretty fast. But actually what you must be thinking is that you need to get every of those notes very accurately. So here's the difference between kind of getting through the notes, which is what I'm going to play first, versus getting actually all the notes very accurately. It sounds like you're kind of rushing through them and you maybe know what the notes are in between, maybe not, but you, as an auditioner, need to make sure every note is heard very clearly. Obviously, you want to start slower. And then get faster and faster and faster. So eventually that you can hear all of those notes in between. That's going to be definitely something that your listeners are going to be listening for, the accuracy of all those notes. And lastly, you end with a fortissimo. You do not want to end your audition with some blasty notes that don't have a good tone. Again, you always want to make sure you play as loud as you can, maintaining a very good tone. So here's what it might sound like if I was blasting, because it's the end of my audition tape and I'm tired and I've been doing lots of work and you've been preparing and you just want to get over with. You don't want to end that way. Here's what that might sound like. Maybe not so good. Think of double forte as full feeling rather than very loud. So it still sounds full, but not blasty. You never want to blast, ever. Okay? So that's it for your Etude number 3. In general, my last tips of advice are: number 1, never play as fast as you can if it's not clean. You always want to play at a tempo that will allow you to play accurately. Number 2, make sure you're always making sure your dynamic levels are distinct, because your ear is different from what other people will hear. And number 3, you always want to maintain a good and consistent tone throughout all the octaves. Good luck.